Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V-Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. I know Michigan basketball is off to an incredible start, but most of us are still laser focused on what's happening with Jim Harbaugh and his team. It's been another big news week. Joining us in just a few minutes on our Game Day segment is recruiting guru Steve Lorenz from 247Sports with his thoughts on all the latest news from Schembechler Hall. Before Steve joins us, a few of my thoughts to get us started. In the coming weeks, I promise we'll turn our attention to Michigan basketball. They deserve it. Last night at Chrysler, we bounced back from that Minnesota loss with a resounding 87-63 win against Maryland. It's beginning to look more and more like Juwan Howard's team is no fluke. They are a contender. Meanwhile, football is front and center when it comes to news. On today's show, Steve and I talked about the new coaching hires, and he said Jim isn't done yet. Now, no more than 15 minutes after we finished taping, it was announced that Jim had hired Dallas Cowboys assistant coach Maurice Lindquist as his new cornerback coach, and according to reports, the new co-defensive coordinator. Mike Zordich is out as a secondary coach. We all knew big change was needed, and we're seeing it take place. My guest today says one thing our new coaches have in common is the fact they are all young, which leads you to believe that being able to relate and recruit these young guys played a big part in their hire. With his thoughts on that and more, we are joined next on our Game Day segment by Steve Lorenz from 247 Sports on this week's edition of The Michigan Man. So stay with us. Here with us on our Game Day segment this week to talk Michigan recruiting, of course, and some of the other news in the Michigan football world right now, Steve Lorenz from 247 Sports. Great to have you back, Steve.
Good to be back, Mike.
Now, before we talk recruiting, let's get your take on some of the new coaching hires that have happened recently, starting with new defensive coordinator Mike Macdonald, who's 33 years old, 34, never been a coordinator yet. And he never even played college football. That sort of surprised me. But a lot of people in the college football world seem to really like this guy, Steve, don't they?
So, position coach in the NFL for how long? It's a guy that's very quickly worked his way up, through the college ranks a little bit. Really, he wasn't even a position coach in college. He went straight to the pros. Worked himself into a position where I believe Martindale is the defensive coordinator for Baltimore. I know McDonald and Jesse Minter, who's rumored to take the DC job at Vanderbilt, were two guys that were believed to be kind of being groomed to eventually take over as DC for the Ravens. So you think about it that way, this is a guy, if say he had stayed on Baltimore staff a couple more years, could have easily been the Ravens defensive coordinator. Baltimore year in and year out has top 5 defenses in the NFL, right? I think this year no exception. So there is some pedigree there. He's not a known name, like some of the names you were hearing kind of thrown about early on, which you kind of look back, it's the retreads that are kind of making the rounds again. You hear Charlie Strong, you hear Will Muschamp and stuff. Those just sound exciting because you know who they are. But Michigan, I think, obviously decided to go a little bit out of the box with this one. But I think the big thing with him and what you're going to see is a pattern with how they fill out their staff, young, energetic, and ready to recruit. And I think that's going to be a not a stark contrast, because Michigan has some really good recruiters on their staff already. But I think from top to bottom, I don't think they had the strongest staff, maybe a little bit weaker than we even thought. So I think you're going to see that, and I think McDonald is going to, as the coordinator, kind of from the top down, is going to set the tone as far as a recruiting standpoint goes. But yeah, the play calling and stuff, we don't know, right? It's going to be really interesting to see what kind of base defenses he run. Is the current roster makeup, is it conducive to what he wants to do? Are there going to be some guys that we thought were going to be really good players for Michigan, kind of we kind of wonder about the Viper specifically, right? As far as are these guys still going to have a role or a spot? How's that going to work? Are they going to play safety? Are they going to bulk them up and keep them at linebacker spot? So that'll be kind of fascinating. I like the hire just because I think it's Harbaugh's if there's one thing, and I know he hasn't hit a home run on every hire, but by and large, his coordinator hires have been pretty solid for the most part, especially in the defensive side of the ball. I mean, you can say what you want about Don Brown, but I don't think you can say big picture-wise that was a bad hire, right? I think his time was kind of up, and I think it was time for him to move on. But it was a great hire. Could argue he was the best DC in the country for the first 3 years he was there. So I think it's going to be interesting. It's fascinating. Not a name that maybe we anticipated from the outset, but yeah, I'm excited. I think this will be. We called it a swing for the fences a little bit on our Wolverine 247 podcast. I don't know if it's quite that. I still think there's, the thing I would tell people is there's no way that John Harbaugh would give Jim a guy that he didn't think was fully capable of being ready to run a college defense. I mean, that's the biggest thing I kind of look at. Even if he thought highly of the guy, may not have thought he was ready to run a college defense. I just don't think that he would have passed, would have kind of given the blessing or kind of said, yeah, this guy's ready if he really wasn't. So one guy I talked to said that Michigan got him at the right time, kind of going back to that rising star thing. It was in a couple of years. He could be an NFL DC someday, could be a head coach at the college level. Just seems like he's kind of on a steady path upwards. And, the sense was from the one guy I talked to that Michigan's getting him at the right time.
Monday night, Jim added Maryland assistant George Hilo, so grabbed a guy out of the Big Ten, out of the East. The special teams coordinator and linebackers coach for the Terps. From what it sounds like, he'll handle Michigan safeties. Isn't that right, Steve?
That's what it sounds like. He's a guy that we don't know a ton about yet. I know, Mike Loxley had a lot of good things to say about him when they hired him at Maryland. But I think 5 years ago, he was a GA at Georgia. Does have some SEC experience. There wasn't quite an overlap with McDonald, but I get the sense that this was a guy that McDonald obviously had a say in. I mean, I think McDonald is going to get to – I don't know if he's going to make every hire on the defensive side of the ball or be the guy that makes that final decision, but I think he's getting a few of his guys, and I think Hilo is one of them. Again, another – this is a fascinating one because we had to do a little bit of digging to get much information on him because he really wasn't listed as a primary recruiter for any of Maryland's signing class they brought in. But Mike Loxley, one of the first things he said when they hired him was they thought he had a chance to be a really, really good recruiter. So young, energetic guy from the South, played at Ole Miss, worked at Alabama, worked at Georgia. I think, again, there's always that thing where when we even don't know a lot about a guy, I think people are like, oh crap, well, who the hell is this guy then? But I think you got to have a little bit of faith as far as, Michigan had some pretty decent names on their list and some guys that they talked to. If this is the guy that McDonald, the thing is with Mike McDonald, new defensive coordinator, it's important that you get the best possible coaches, but you want coaches that know what type of defense they're going to, understand the type of defense that's going to be run. And, there is something to be said about cohesiveness and chemistry on a staff. So having some guys he may be familiar with or understands the coaching style of, is pretty important, And so my thought is, though, always a young guy is going to be a plus on the recruiting trail unless they're a total dud. And there's nothing to suggest that he is a dud, even though I said he wasn't a primary for anybody at Maryland. A special teams coordinator is not necessarily – that can vary as far as their recruiting role goes. So he's going to be of the guys they fill the staff out with, he'll be the one that I think ends up kind of being a wild card. But can't be any worse than not having a coach on the field at the position, so like they did this year. So in that regard, just logically, they're better off than they were in 2020. So it's fascinating though. Not a name we had really even heard going into the search.
Well, another thing that Michigan fans were thrilled about last week was when Mike Hart was brought back as the running back coach, which sort of surprised me. I mean, he was assistant head coach or associate head coach at Indiana, had churned out some NFL caliber running backs, but coming back to his alma mater, I guess that was something he could not refuse.
Sounds like it. I mean, the dynamic in the past between he and Harbaugh, I think made this really fascinating that Hart saw an opportunity and wanted to come back to Michigan. I think anybody who, I was in the same graduating class at Michigan as Mike Hart, so very familiar with not only his abilities on the field, but his passion for the University of Michigan, all that. Because, like, kind of thinking now that he's on staff, it's like you just kind of felt like someday that Mike Hart was going to be on, especially when you started to see how successful, he was. He had a good tenure at Eastern and had a good tenure at Western, moved up to Indiana, was moving up within their ranks, like you said, associate head coach. It's like the more he's moving up the ranks, it's like somebody just kind of felt like someday that Mike Hart would end up on the Michigan staff somehow. So in that regard, I mean, just from a personal, it's kind of cool, that he's back. I think it's neat, but it's not a hire for show. I mean, the guy can coach. He's proven it, and I think one thing to consider here, Zach Charbonnet entered the transfer portal yesterday, so he's losing one of his backs, which not a huge surprise necessarily, but is Donovan Edwards, who the West Bloomfield freshman who will enroll after. I don't know if he ended up showing up to campus or if he's going to play in the state title game this weekend. But, biggest thing with Donovan Edwards, who now has a chance to make an early impact with Charbonnet out, is Edwards' biggest liability on the field is his ball security. And it's kind of funny is like they hired Mike Hart at the right time, because we all know Mike Hart, ball security was what he was outside of just his skill, but he only fumbled twice in his career, and it was in the same game, right?
Right.
So interesting dichotomy there, where I think Hart is a good fit for Edwards from that standpoint, but also, I know Bryce Marichar, one of our analysts there at TMI, talked to Ron Bellamy and said that he thinks that their personalities are going to mesh really, really well as far as a coach to player type deal. And Edwards looked excellent against Belleville, in their big win last weekend. So, that part's going to be pretty fascinating. But from an overall standpoint, again, I mean, we were asked is like, what kind of recruiter is Mike Hart going to be? And it's like, I mean, it's Mike Hart at Michigan. You're going to get full effort, and his, he wears his passion for Michigan on his sleeve. So I think from that standpoint, you can't say anything, but it's going to be a plus, right? I mean, I just can't fathom that he's not going to have an impact on the recruiting trail. So yeah, like I said, I think it's pretty cool. It's also another example of to me, of Harbaugh's willing to do what it takes in his mind to win, because we know, like I said, we know about the history between those two guys. And while I think the hatchet had been buried a while ago, just for it to come full circle and for him to bring him on staff, I think is another indication that, he wants to do whatever he can to build the best staff and to try to win some football games.
Do you think he being Jim is done yet, or should we expect more changes? I know a lot of people have thought maybe we're bringing in a co-offensive coordinator. Joe Moorhead's name was thrown out there, but do you think we're set now with the staff?
No, I think there'll be some more changes. I think there'll be multiple announcements probably within, and I can't give a timeline because it's already gone way slower than we thought it was going to go. I mean, this has been like molasses as far as the timelines with these. I mean, I've seen a couple. Now they haven't officially announced the Hilo hire, so technically it's only been McDonald and Hart, but again, we assume that's coming, but we expect there'll be some other changes made for sure.
All right, so we'll stay tuned on that. So let's start talking about the recruiting front, Steve. A lot going on right now. Fans are familiar with most of the names in the class of 2021. I just wanted to touch on a few of them and get your thoughts on some of the big names, some of which could have an early impact, some not. J.J. McCarthy, highest-rated quarterback commitment of the Harbaugh era. Are you excited to see him compete for the starting job this fall?
Absolutely. And I don't think there's any doubt that he's going to get every opportunity to compete for that spot too. Not just the highest ranked quarterback they've brought in, but when I guess this corresponds with being the highest ranked guy, but he's the most talented passer they've brought in for sure. Really lived up to expectations at IMG Academy. And, we've talked about it on our recruiting pod a couple times and just throughout. I mean, he's been committed to Michigan forever. Just a different kid from a makeup standpoint. Really, truly feels like wise beyond his years. We joked that we needed to reevaluate our priorities and stuff after talking to him, just kind of joking around, with how heavy he is. And just, he is. He seems like a kid who understands the magnitude. I think sometimes these kids might not understand or not that they're supposed to, but the pressure at Michigan right now is different than it is at almost any other program in the country, right? It's a different type of pressure right now because of Ohio State, and just, you have the largest alumni base in the country, and just kind of been in this like middle area for seems like forever, right? And so, I think a lot of guys are sometimes taken aback when they get here. They read the newspaper, they see all the stuff. I think McCarthy's a guy well aware of what's in front of him, the hurdles, the obstacles there, and so really they couldn't have reeled in and signed a better leader for this class coming in than they could have with him. But on top of that, just for this year's roster, he's going to have a shot for sure. Absolutely. I think maybe try to bulk him up, physically, maybe build him up a little bit more, but I mean, he's got a great arm. I wouldn't say he has like a rocket necessarily, but he has a more than adequate arm in the college game. But just seems to make lots of really great plays, makes the right decision. And like I said, at IMG, he was excellent this year. I know Andrew Ivins, our Miami, actually he's our Southeast analyst now, like a regional guy, watched IMG a few times live and said that, even as highly as we had McCarthy ranked, he said he's better than I thought he was going to be. So, there's that. But also, yeah, I mean, McNamara looked good. We don't know about Milton. Milton was up and down. So I think even though they have quarterbacks on the roster, pretty decent ones, I think there's no way that you're not going to say that McCarthy doesn't have a shot to come right in and win that job.
Well, Michigan fans held their breaths almost to the last minute, waiting for Donovan Edwards to commit. Does this kid, in your opinion, have what it takes to step in this fall and play right away, Steve?
I think so. So, Michigan, their 4-back rotation got a lot of criticism, right? I'd be interested to see if they – well, it was like a blessing and a curse because all 4 guys are – really, you take 2 of them, could have been the starting 2. Like, all 4 of these guys had opportunity, would have been big-time players elsewhere, right? It was a really kind of a hard – situation, I feel like. So I'm wondering, and I don't know if they're going to repeat that or not next year. Charbonnet's departure probably sets the tone for a 3-man, so I don't think they want to just go in with 2 guys, especially because they like to use Corum in a lot of different ways. He's not just a between the tackles type back. So Edwards, yeah, I mean, really to me, like I mentioned before with Mike Hart, it really to me comes down to Edwards' ability to secure the ball and to not fumble. Because I know that's been an issue, and I know that when Michigan was recruiting him, there was a lot of talk about tips on his technique and breaking some bad habits as far as how he holds the ball when he runs it and stuff like that. He has everything else. I saw the couple of the highlights from that Belleville game that I mentioned earlier last weekend. He had some I know he wears number 6, but he had some Ty Wheatley to him almost in his acceleration ability. The one play that he scored on that got called back, you don't normally see guys that big running away from guys, that quickly, and that's where you talk about Ty Wheatley was the size of a linebacker, was leaving corners and safeties in the dust, constantly. And, that's just one run. I don't think I'd compare him to Wheatley. Otherwise, I don't think his track times were close to Wheatley's, but just – right. So I don't think anybody's were, but just a guy who, but still though looks like a guy who can maybe hit the home run at the back position. So, I think Edwards will have a shot, but I wouldn't write off Dunlap either. The other guy they got out of Texas who also enrolled early and is on campus now. I think he's another guy to watch as far as really a guy that played in one of the most difficult conferences or the difficult classes in Texas, one of the highest classes in Texas, and was awesome. I mean, I know he had a 99-yard touchdown run early on this season. I think he also had like a 93 or a 94-yard touchdown run. I mean, he's a guy that can hit some home runs too. So, whoever established themselves out of those 2 guys will probably be that 3rd back. But yeah, I don't know if they'll rotate 4 in like they did last year. I think they're probably going to try to avoid that.
Well, another name I hear a lot about, I've seen very little tape on him, 4-star Fresno wideout Xavier Worthy. I don't know, as I said, much about him, but he sure looks, when you see him, like an elite talent, doesn't he, Steve?
You're talking about Michigan greats. I know on our recruiting pod with Sam Webb and myself and Bryce Merritt had mentioned his gait, like the way he runs kind of reminded us of Anthony Carter. Not his ability necessarily, although, I mean, he ran a 10.55, 100 meters. This kid can fly. I mean, he's probably got to be one of the 2 or 3 fastest kids in the entire class, regardless of position. Year one guy, to me, regardless, I know they have a lot of guys coming back at receiver, right? But a guy that I think would make an instant impact for Michigan in the passing game. He's long, already talked about his speed, showcased excellent hands. You know, the only downside with some of these guys, and Worthy being one of them, they didn't get a senior season, right? So that's kind of the ultimate sort of the curveball this cycle with a lot, you know, with all the cancellations and stuff and states just canceling their season completely, is like, how long does it take some of these guys to get acclimated to like actually playing a live game in pads again, you know? And so, but of the guys that had their seasons canceled, I think Worthy's one who 100% would at least have an opportunity to play right away. I could see him being a special teams, you know, or returner. I mean, he's just, he was a guy when he was rated in 87, we had him rated in his film and saying, there's no way that, like, he was one of those guys, like every once in a while they'll offer somebody and you'll just kind of turn on the tape, and you don't even need to be like some film guru or anything like that to just turn it on and say, no, this guy's way better than what he's ranked. And if you go to his huddle video, his last one, his junior season, it was like the 3rd play or something. It's like you watch, like, this guy's at least a 4-star. I mean, this guy's insanely good. And it turned out he's but we have him in the top 100 now. So that's the type of talent, you know, Michigan, I think, has been kind of recruiting at receiver. I personally think he's the most talented receiver they've recruited under Harbaugh. That includes Donovan. He's faster than Donovan was. He's not quite as big. You know, Donovan was already sort of college ready from a physical standpoint, but he's faster. I think he has the same amount of ball skills. And, if he's able to, able to acclimate himself quickly with pads on, I think he's a guy who can instant impact.
Any other names other than the 3 we've talked about, Steve, that you think could come in and get playing time right away in this class?
Well, Junior Colson, and again, this all depends on the defensive philosophy of McDonald, because Don Brown recruited most of these guys. But Junior Colson, to me, is probably like similar to Worthy defensively, as far as he is unnaturally athletic for his size. It'll just be a matter of, does Michigan decide to play him as sort of a box safety now, or do they bulk him up and put him on the edge? That's going to be one that it depends on, what Mike McDonald wants to run. But he was kind of primarily a Viper, but he's a guy though that I think will be able to break that mold. Like, he's not a guy that's so plugged into that spot that he couldn't be really, really good elsewhere. So of the other guys, he's probably the one I would look at. I wouldn't write off a kid like El Hadi on the offensive line, who's kind of gets the award for a guy that was committed so long that it doesn't seem like it was a big deal that he was committed anymore. But when actuality, he was their number 1 overall target on the offensive line. I mean, he's such a huge part of this class, but he was committed for like 2 years. Yeah. It's like people kind of forget, you know what I mean? People kind of forget about those kids that you didn't like, that didn't pick a hat on ESPN or something like that. The guys that committed right away and stayed true the entire time. I mean, he's a top 100 recruit. Michigan lost Zach Carpenter. Not sure if they'll lose any more in the portal or not up front, but either way, they're still pretty deep across the board, but he's a really big talent. So there's a guy that I wouldn't necessarily write off, also enrolled early too. So, gets that little advantage as far as that goes. So those would probably be a couple other guys I would think about there.
Given all the drama surrounding the program in the fall, both on and off the field, this class ended up 13th nationally, 2nd in the Big Ten, which is very good. Maybe not elite, but very, very good, Steve, wasn't it?
13th, and also the other thing to keep in mind, I think last year in 20, they finished 10th. Their actual per recruit average is higher in 2021 than it is 2020. And on top of that, that's with a kid with 2 guys who are an 80 and an 81 respectively on the composite, which are, and it's whatever. It's not like who cares, but just in that context, that's a really big anchor on that per recruit average score, right? The average would be somewhere closer to probably 91.5, closer to 92. I mean, those are 2 of literally the lowest ranked commits in any Big Ten class this season. When you're talking 91.5, 92 average, you're somewhere between like 5th and 7th in the country on a per recruit average. So it's a much more it's a deeper class than 2020 is at the top as far as having some, elite guys. It's just they took a couple rolls of the dice. Well, and their punter's one of them. I mean, we've tried to talk to our national team about redoing the special teams rankings, because the number one punter in the country should not be a guy that's bringing your average down that much.
Yeah.
Maybe do special teams separately or something. You know what I mean? It's like, that doesn't logically make sense, because punters and kickers are really important in the college game too. That these guys would be kind of dragging down the average or whatever. But so yeah, a little more of a top heavy class this year, and a little deeper, I think, but roughly around the same as 2020 from a ranking standpoint.
Well, it's only January, but recruiting is really full throttle for the class of 2022 right now. It's taking shape. So let's take a look at some of the highest rated kids we're all going after, Stephen, and get your take on some of them. Modern day 5-star cornerback Damani Jackson. I think he's ranked number 3 overall in the class, number 1 cornerback. I know Ohio State and USC are in big on him right now. Your take on him?
So I think Jackson's the top player in that class, regardless of position. I think he's that good. I think he'd be a borderline 5-star prospect in this last class in 21. He's already physically there. I'm not trying to sound outrageous or anything. I think Jackson's physically capable of playing in college. I mean, he's legit 6'1". He's a full 187, 190. That's a college level cornerback size right there. A lot of connections to Michigan. Family's originally from Youngstown. Dad's a big Michigan fan. However, right now he's planning on announcing it on the 23rd, which, what's that, like, I don't even know what day it is, like 4 days away, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we're expecting him to verbally commit to USC, but I would say I don't think that recruitment is going to be completely over. He actually visited Michigan on his own dime for the weekend they played Wisconsin, which, as you know, probably ends up being the worst visit weekend for anybody for a recruit to come up. I mean, they got shellacked, but did come up. And despite the loss, and this is a fact, he nearly committed to Michigan while he was on the visit. He's kind of shown a penchant for being close to committing a few times. So those kind of recruitments, I believe, don't tend to be over when the first verbal commitment's made. So will be quite a task for the new Michigan's defensive staff, to kind of work on, but far from a guy they're going to stop with. I mean, I'd argue he and Will Johnson, who I assume we'll be talking about here shortly, probably the top 2 guys on their board overall.
Oh, right. I mean, great cornerback, and you just mentioned Will Johnson, best we've got in the state of Michigan right now. They would make a nice pair together on the field, but Will is a 5-star. Given his proximity, a lot of Big Ten schools are after him. Ohio State, I think, is recruiting him hard, but gosh, being a Michigan legacy, you would think he's 100% Michigan, wouldn't you?
Well, you'd think, right? So,
yeah.
About that. No, so actually, it's interesting. He and Damani Jackson have a very, very tight bond, weirdly enough, which this is where it's going to annoy the hell out of people, which really took place when they both were on Michigan's campus for that Wisconsin weekend. But as of right now, the crystal ball is in favor of Michigan for Will Johnson. I'm just not sure where that one's headed right now. The thing is, there's plenty of time with some of these guys. I do think it'll be a typical deal where some guys make early verbal commitments and then still are going to be recruited. I mean, Michigan, Ohio State, really the same 3 schools, to be honest with you. Michigan, Ohio State, USC. Ohio State's already got a commitment from a 5-star corner out of Florida. We think SC will get the verbal from Jackson here shortly. Johnson, I think it's a little bit up in the air. I think the biggest thing with him is I think, and I want to say Bryce reported the other day that Mike McDonald has actually already talked to Will Johnson. Is going to, that's really, I think he's going to be the number 1 priority right out the gates for this defensive staff to say, hey, let's get to know each other a little bit more before you make any decisions or anything like that. Because, I mean, let's just face the fact. I mean, this sweeping change defensively as far as the staff goes is not going to help in the short term on the recruiting trail, right? I mean, because you got new guys that are going to have to come in and develop relationships and all that kind of stuff makes it difficult, with some of these kids who don't want the process to stretch out too long. So long story short, I think that one's kind of up in the air right now. I think that's going to be Michigan's number one priority moving forward is kind of working to get him, because he's a legacy. I mean, it'd be embarrassing, to an extent to me, because not only is he a legacy, but Michigan really, really needs cornerbacks in this 2022 class. It is their biggest need, probably by a long shot. So not only do you have the legacy situation, but you have a legitimate pitch to a kid like this to come in and play right away. It's not a created pitch to try to get a guy to commit. I mean, it's a real deal where it's like, hey, if you commit and sign here, you're going to get every opportunity to play right away. So to whiff on something like that would be really bad, just be honest, because, like I said, Michigan needs corners. They've been in on a lot of elite corners in this class, and they haven't locked any of them up yet. And then the longer this goes, you see the staff turnover, uncertainty kind of starts to creep in. So, but no, Wills, I think, is a little bit up in the air right now. That'd be the best way to put it.
Got to get him. You got to get your local kids. So we'll see how that turns out. But another two receivers were in on, two 4-stars that very highly recruited. The first one is St. Rita, Illinois 4-star Caleb Brown. He's ranked number 50 overall in the class, the number 7 wide receiver. I know Ohio State was in on him big, but I think they've dropped back some, haven't they, Steve?
Yes and no. I think they're still there. So Brown is one of and you're seeing a growing number of kids, very quiet, doesn't do interviews, doesn't really play his hand at all. Michigan leads the crystal ball there. This actually might be a Michigan-Ohio State deal. And what's interesting when recruiting against Ohio State at the receiver spot is Ohio State has recruited it so well that to me, it's almost gotten to the point where, like, if I was an elite receiver prospect, I don't know if I would want to commit to Ohio State. I believe, have assigned 8 top 100 receivers in the last 3 cycles and have the commitment from the number 1 receiver in the 2022 class already in Caleb Burton. They've recruited the receiver position, you could argue, I think, better than any program has recruited any single position in the last 3 or 4 cycles since Brian Hartline took over for Zach Smith. Their recruiting at receiver has exploded. So kind of one of those deals where it's like, Olave's coming back. It's like that's a whole different deal, but their talent at receiver is unmatched almost. And you kind of wonder if some of these guys, how do they see a path to the playing field? But, with Michigan pretty deep at receiver too themselves, they're no slouches at what they have at receiver, and they've recruited it really well under Gaddis. And I know that's the connection. I think Gaddis has done a really good job there. Sharon Moore involved. Sharon Moore's kind of been the point guy in Chicago for Michigan. And then also any kid out of the greater Chicago area knows who J.J. McCarthy is and has probably played with him in some 7-on-7 type capacity. Brown is one of those guys. And so I think that's where Michigan's kind of trying to angle it, is the opportunity to play with McCarthy at the next level, and it'd be a shorter path to the playing field. But that one, Michigan, Ohio State, probably Notre Dame in there somewhere. And actually another program, because I'm assuming we'll talk about Tyler Morris next, another program recruiting both those guys really well is Missouri, actually, has done a decent job of, kind of making themselves a little bit of a presence in the Chicago area. So we'll see with Caleb Brown. But again, very quiet kid. Kind of reminds me of Golden Tate. Really good after the catch. Not the tallest guy. Great hands. Shifty. He actually plays a lot of running back for his high school too. Pretty interesting. Yeah, very interesting prospect, actually. One of the more interesting kids in that cycle as far as his film goes. But almost kind of your classic Midwest deal, right? Michigan, Ohio State, Notre Dame. Like I said, kind of throw Missouri in there a little bit too.
Well, you're right, Steve. Next on my list was Tyler Morris, and he went to Nazareth Academy. If that name rings a bell with you, it should. J.J. McCarthy, before he left for IMG, went to Nazareth Academy. Tyler is a 4-star, ranked number 75 overall in this class, number 11 wide receiver. And he's another kid Notre Dame is in on too. He's very good academically, but he'd be another nice get. And you would think with the recruiter that J.J. McCarthy is, chances are he'll land here.
So this one is one I think there's some confidence on, right? Michigan's done a really good job in this one. I have my crystal ball in on Michigan. Missouri, like I said, is actually another program that's made a strong push there. And Notre Dame, for a while, Notre Dame was tepidly recruiting him, but I actually think part of it was because he was such a heavy Michigan lean for a while. But you see, but this is what happens when Michigan goes 2-4 and Notre Dame goes to the playoff, is whether it's Notre Dame or anybody else, like that gives you the cachet to come in and say, hey, like we went to the playoffs. You know what I mean? It's just, it's that simple. Yeah. That stuff resonates with kids, right? So all that being said, I still feel like this is one where Michigan, this would be another one of those would be a big disappointment if Michigan didn't eventually seal the deal on this one, because they've had a really big lead for a while. He's really, as you'd expect, very tight with J.J. McCarthy. I think the opportunity to play with him at Michigan is something he's really thought hard about, and then stuff like that. But, so probably, again, Michigan, Notre Dame, and Mizzou, probably the three schools you hear about most with him.
Another kid I wanted to ask you about was a Michigan kid, Traverse City Central, four-star linebacker Joshua Burnham, number 114 overall in the class, number 9 outside linebacker. He's had the offer for quite a while, but I guess his family wants him to do his due diligence, and even Alabama and Clemson are recruiting him, but chances still look pretty good for him, don't they?
I think so. Any defensive recruit right now, we got to see how they react to the new hires, right? I mean, he was recruited by Don Brown. Family's big Michigan family, which always helps, never hurts. That being said, though, I think this is another one where you'd be pretty disappointed if a new, young, energetic staff with NFL ties wouldn't be able to reel this guy in, right? I mean, I tell you what, because McDonald seems to have more experience with a 3-4 type, he, to me, is a perfect fit on the outside of a 3-4 defense. I mean, I think he'd be a monster in this type of defense. So it'll be interesting to see where those, because I assume, I actually checked with Burnham the other day, hadn't heard from Mike McDonald yet, but I can't imagine it's going to be long until he for all I know, he may have heard from him in the interim at this point, because he's another top priority kid in state. But yeah, I think this would be a difficult one for Michigan to swallow if they lost. He has listened to other programs. I don't think he'd go far. He'd be another one where if it was anybody else, it'd be a Notre Dame or a Michigan or a Ohio State or something like that. Ohio State already has 3 outside linebackers committed in the 2022 class, so I don't even know how much they would need that addition. But if you're them, you'd do it to take it away from Michigan, right? I mean, that'd probably be the logic there if you could. So, but no, tough one for Michigan to swallow if they couldn't get him. And like I said, I don't know if that's what Mike McDonald's going to run, but history and just his coaching, he's always coached with 3-4 type defenses. He would be an absolute perfect fit on the outside in a 3-4 for sure.
Well, as far as cornerbacks go, we've already mentioned Damani Jackson and Will Johnson, 2 huge targets there. But there's also a third kid that's intriguing out of Bergen Catholic, a school we're familiar with. 4-star Jaden Gold. He's rated number 141 overall in the class, number 16 cornerback. From what you read, he's also seriously considering USC and Texas and their situations as far as coaching influx also. So it might be a while before he commits, Steve, right?
Yeah, so now I think he's another one is waiting to learn more about this Michigan unit and learn about Mike McDonald and stuff, because he's another one that if things had stayed status quo, let's say Michigan had gone 4-2, and they kept everybody on, and they were going to go into next year, I think there's a chance he'd already be committed. But, again, these are what happen when you go 2-4, and national media is breathing down your neck, and no positive stories out there is like kind of give some of these kids pause. And Gould is a big-time lean for a while. Has already visited Michigan twice, I want to say. And even because at first, as a Jersey kid, Partridge left. Campanile, who has deep ties to Bergen Catholic, also left. And then he was one we kind of wondered, well, there that goes. He's probably not going to be that interested, but that was not true at all. I mean, he was still very highly interested even after they left and was still a big lean. I think Michigan's crap season opened the door a little bit to some other programs, but he's another one, though, where, man, it'd just be really disappointing because that he's been kind of favoring Michigan for a while. Penn State, probably another program to throw in there, too, as making a push recently. But yeah, as you can tell, kind of a theme here, there's a little bit of pressure on McDonald and the rest of the defensive staff right away to get back in and lock some of these kids up, because the chips were set for Michigan to reel in some big-time players on the defensive side of the ball in 22, and so they got to kind of get that ball back rolling again because if they don't, it's going to be massively disappointing on a few different levels.
Well, anyone that watched Michigan football this year knows that we need some help on the defensive line, need to get some beef there and get the depth built up. There are two guys that I've seen that I really like, four-star, Chaparral, Arizona, Anthony Lucas. Now, he's ranked number 164 in the class overall, number 11 defensive tackle. Some people, when you read, say he's very interested in UCLA. We'll see, but Michigan's done a lot of work on this kid, haven't they?
Yes, and actually, even though he's from Arizona, he's already visited, which is always big to get a guy up. True DT, in my opinion. Arizona kids are kind of it's interesting. They'll go anywhere. Weirdly enough, not necessarily married out west. I do agree though about UCLA. That's kind of a program that's been mentioned consistently with him. We'll see if Sean Nua's fate has any impact here, whether he stays or goes. Nua obviously, as an Arizona guy, came from Arizona State, was recruiting Lucas at Arizona State before he came to Michigan. That's how long this kid's been recruited for. So there's a good connection, good relationship there, but. Yeah, tackles obviously. They do. To be fair, Michigan does have two defensive tackles committed right now with Van Sumeren and Devontae Miles, but still, they want to keep beefing up. I think they need to, and Lucas is right up there in my opinion as far as the guys they really like. And so, but yeah, Arizona kids could kind of end up anywhere. But UCLA is a one school, and again, go back to Arizona State. Herm Edwards has kind of brought some energy to that program a little bit too, so I would never write them off, for an elite in-state guy at this point. And we'll have to see with Don Brown at Arizona now, that whole thing just starting with Jed Fish and Don Brown, you wonder if Arizona will probably try to make a strong run at him also.
Another kid closer to home that gets a lot of talk is in Indiana, Brebeuf Jesuit four-star defensive end, Joe Strickland, number 202 overall right now in the class, number 11 strong side defensive end. Like a lot of guys on the list, Michigan jumped out to a good lead for him this past summer, before football season started. This kid even took his own self-guided visit before the season started to Michigan, so you would think we're in a strong position with him.
Yeah, I think he's a kid that Michigan will have a real shot with as long as he vibes with the new defensive staff and, feels comfortable in the scheme. Mm-hmm. It's those types of questions that I think got to be answered, and they have to, going to have to show the kids, this is how we'd use you compared to the last staff, or maybe they wouldn't even compare it to last staff. But he's one, though, would be a great fit in a 3-4 at one of the end spots, and that's where there's such a difference between a 4-3 and a 3-4 and how you'd utilize some of these guys, whereas he could have been a guy maybe would have played like an anchor in the 4-3, next to the defensive tackle. And I think in the 3-4, I think he's almost a better fit just as one of the edge guys, and so I think could be a beneficial situation for him there. Indiana, quietly, maybe not quietly just because they had a great season. I think Indiana has made some headway. I don't know with their defensive coordinator leaving also, if that, Kane Womack leaving for, I think, South Alabama, if that has an impact or not. But, one thing I would watch there is if Notre Dame offers. I do not believe they have offered him yet. That would be one to watch as a in-state guy. Indiana, close proximity. Notre Dame, like I said, going to the playoff. I think that's one to watch. And so that'd be a situation there. But, yeah, this is one where Michigan probably, I think at this point, feels pretty good on where they stand. But, again, it'll depend on the retention of Nua and if he stays, how that continues, or if they replace him, how that new defensive line coach, along with McDonald, kind of can gel and vibe with him a little bit.
Well, there are so many others that we've offered in this class of 2022, but we'll leave that for the next time and go into a little more depth on that. But final question for you right now, Steve. As good as this year's class was, next year's 2022 is shaping up to be very good. A lot of people I read outside of our Michigan recruiters and our Big Ten recruiters seem to think that Jim needs to change the way he's recruiting, the type of kids he's recruiting, maybe even start to really get into Ohio again more. I don't know if that's fair or true, but do you think there's something to that?
Well, with Ohio, the thing is, again, just facts, but Ohio State's pretty much getting who they want out of Ohio, and I don't think that it's not even a Harbaugh problem. That was something going on well before he was ever hired. Like I've compared Ohio State's recruiting. It's a snowball that started in 2000 under Tressel. Michigan, the one year that they recruited Ohio really, 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 really well was in between the hiring of Tressel and Meyer. You remember the Kalis, Wormley, Strobel, DeMonte Thomas, like that group of guys. That was really the only time that Michigan had any huge success in Ohio. I went back and looked at the numbers because I was curious myself. They've offered around the same amount of kids proportionally in Ohio under Harbaugh than they did under Hoke. Maybe a little bit more aggressive under Hoke, but to be fair, while Hoke did hit Ohio hard, they had a lot of misses with some lower ranked guys in Ohio too. And so the one I kind of look at it as what we've noticed from a macro standpoint. The elite prospects coming out of the state of Ohio has kind of started to trend down a little bit, whereas the state of Michigan has actually slightly trended up. And I'm wondering if there shouldn't be more of an emphasis on not letting the kids in state leave. Now there's other factors though that, it's out of Michigan's hands, out of Harbaugh's hands, especially. There's nothing to Harbaugh, with the academics and all that kind of stuff. It's not as easy to get into Michigan as it is some other programs. And again, these are just facts, and there are guys that fans want. Why didn't Michigan get that guy? And it's like, well, there's reasons out of Harbaugh's control, really. And that, again, these aren't excuses. This is just factual information, So I think it appears early on with the hires that they have made that they're going with more of a youth movement on the coaching staff. And I think you'll see it, at the very least, you'll see a more aggressive recruiting approach in general. So I think he's kind of heeded that advice to an extent. I just don't know if it has to be a geographical type deal. The fact is, the most talent-rich states in the country are still California, Texas, Georgia, Florida. They're probably missing somebody else in there, but it's really New Jersey. There's just North Carolina is another one too. But it's as important to build connections in those states where there's the state of Georgia had 42 4-star prospects or something like that. It's ridiculous. Georgia is almost to the point where Texas and Texas A&M are, where you don't even have to leave your backyard to sign a top 7 or 8 recruiting class. So you could fill your class within a 50-mile radius of your campus, and so so for Michigan, I think it's as important to maintain and to work hard in those areas of the country as it is, in Ohio or whatever. So to me, it's lockdown in-state, and then don't neglect. Try to make hires that have connections in some of the more talent-rich areas in the country. Which again, Mike McDonald, deep Georgia connection, right? He worked under Mark Richt. He coached high school football in Georgia before he was a GA at Georgia. Cedar Shoals, I think was the name of the high school. So, I think and even like I said, Hilo, coach under Nick Saban, coached at Georgia, played at Ole Miss. You got to think these guys understand how important recruiting is coming from SEC country, right? So, I think that's maybe going to be the philosophy going forward. I've been adamant that you can coach all day in X's and O's and stuff, but it's tried and true. You're seeing it every year now with the same 5 teams rotating into the playoff every year, that recruiting is as important as anything is. So, you got to put an emphasis on recruiting from top to bottom. And that's what I think these hires kind of indicate.
Absolutely.
And aim towards recruiting, top 5 classes every year. So can they do it? We'll see. You still got to win. You can have all the best recruiters in the country. You go 2-4, it's not going to hurt. It's not going to help you. So, we'll just have to see.
Here with us on our Game Day segment this week has been Steve Lorenz from 247 Sports, talking recruiting, which my listeners can't get enough of. Steve, love to hear what you have to say. So we'll get together next month. As we know, it never ends, the recruiting. We might have dead periods, but it's never ending, and there's always news. So we thank you for so much time this morning, Steve, and we look forward to that next visit.
No problem, Mike.
On Quick Hits today, as we mentioned at the top of the show, Michigan bounced back against Maryland in a big way with an 87-83 win at Chrysler last night. Isaiah Livers led the way with 20 points, and Franz Wagner chipped in 15 points. Number 17 Michigan is now 12-1 overall, 7-1 in Big Ten play. We'll be back in action Friday night down in West Lafayette against Purdue. Coach Barnes Arico's women's basketball team, 10-0 overall, 5-0 in the Big Ten, travels to Columbus to face number 17 ranked Ohio State on Thursday afternoon, in the first of 2 games scheduled between these old rivals. The game is set for 3 p.m. and will be broadcast live on the Big Ten Network. Michigan moved up to number 11 in this week's Associated Press poll, the highest ranking in program history. After posting a weekend sweep of Ohio State, the number 8 ranked University of Michigan hockey team looks to keep things rolling when it takes on number 16 Notre Dame on Thursday and Friday in South Bend. Both matchups are set for 6:30 p.m., with Thursday's game to be streamed live on NBCSports.com, and Friday's contest will be broadcast live on NBC Sports Network. Thanks again to Steve Lorenz from 247 Sports for joining us today. It's my plan to have Steve with us monthly to talk recruiting right up until next season starts. And I know you guys enjoy Steve, so rest assured he'll be back in February. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Juwan Howard and his team deserve a lot of attention. My scheduled guest next week is the radio play-by-play voice of Michigan basketball, Brian Bush. So make sure you join us. That does it for another show. Thanks to each and every one of you for taking time from your busy lives to download the show and tune us in. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!